Welcome back to History 1302. Today's lecture is a continuation of the transformation of the American West, but we are going to be focusing on, Native Americans pretty much being under siege. Before we get into, the different policies and the different problems that arose with the Native Americans and the federal government, I want to talk about, the fact that, there was about 360,000 Native Americans that were scattered throughout the Trans-Missouri West. But they were in the way, so to speak, of advancing white pioneers. And so this is going to result in this inevitable clash of cultures and people. Since the continuation of American expansion, there had really been like a three-step cycle in the relationship between American Indians and their primarily white counterparts. And so the first step in the cycle is pretty much contact, okay? Native Americans are going to begin to, quote unquote, adapt to a greater or lesser extent some white ways, okay? So they're going to start this, the beginning of this adaptation process. The second step is that Native Americans are going to die off from certain diseases in droves, okay? Sometimes these epidemics will kill whole cities, other times, smaller amounts, but overall, they will die in large percentage numbers. Lastly, the third step here is, whites are going to continue to push natives off of that coveted land. Once Native Americans are weakened because of the diseases and because of war, whites are essentially going to push and push until they are off the land that they want. And so the series of events that brought on, Native American land under the control of the federal government, the control of white settlers, begins to take place around the 1840s all the way up to the 1880s. And there are these series of events here as well. So the first thing that happens is, the American government tries to organize all of its territories west of the Mississippi into territories. And so no longer is this a great unknown wilderness, right? It becomes organized. We're talking about territories like Utah and Colorado, and continuation of that. The other thing as well, the other sort of like major event that takes place here is the gold rush, right? So it started in California in 1848, and then by 1849 you got massive amounts of gold rush seekers that are going to be pouring into that region as well. And so that's another event that is going to bring Native Americans and white Americans into conflict with one another. By 1862, we see the government passing the Homestead Act. Okay, and so essentially, what happens here is, say you go, into this land that you're getting from the federal government, you're going to make improvements on it because that's part of, the requirements here. You can either have it dirt cheap or, for free in some events. And so the fact that people are pouring into this region for land, for gold opportunities as well. And because of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, these are going to have severe consequences on Native Americans in the way that they live, in the way that they move about the country. It's going to have profound effects, very negative effects here. Okay, so as the U.S. government is essentially solidifying its power on both coasts, and they begin to organize this area, they have to figure out what to do with the people that are already living there. Okay, so settlers on the way, overland to Oregon and California are going to become targets of Indian threats. And you see here, the consequences of what happens when these Americans are moving about the area that is largely inhabited by Native Americans. So, the federal government is going to attempt to reduce those tensions, and they're going to create these new tribal boundaries in the Great Plains with two new treaties in the early 1850s. The first one is the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which is going to establish these tribal zones for the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crows, and others. And it's basically going to allow for the building of roads and posts along those tribal lands. Okay, so what we're talking about here is this reservation policy. Okay, the main idea here behind the justification, is this argument that the Native Americans, the people that are on that land, that they're quote unquote not using the land properly. Okay, that's their words, that's their justification. So the idea is, okay, so these people, they don't even know how to use the land right. So why don't we just put them in this small tract of land, right? Move them out of the way, so to speak. And it helps to kind of help us understand the attitudes towards Native Americans in the early stages of this conflict. Okay, so these points here are to help explain a lot about the Native American policy during this time. Okay, so under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, number one, Natives were required to move to a reservation. Okay, this is not an option. Remember, the idea is that they don't even know how to use the land right, so we're just going to move them out of the way because they're getting in the way. We have all of this conflict. We have Americans that are losing their lives because they're simply moving about the country, and so we need to do something and step in and protect them. So what does the government do? Move them to these reservations. It's not an option. Okay. The second point here is that Native Americans are heavily encouraged to pick up white ways. Okay. And by white ways, they're talking specifically farming, living on these like permanent structures, right? Like homes and stuff like that. Instead of how the natives were, relatively nomadic, right? They're moving about the country, the region, because they are following the herd, because they're following those animals that they use to harvest. They use every part of the animal, right? The fur, the hide, the leather, the meat, everything. And so, again, they're essentially saying, you can't do that anymore. We want you to be on these reservations. Oh, and by the way, we want you to, live in these permanent structures, not be moving around so much, and, grow your own food instead. Now, the other sort of part to this Treaty of Fort Laramie is, the government creates this Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is essentially supposed to promise to protect them. Think of it kind of like, the Freedmen's Bureau, how it was supposed to help former slaves, adapt to life after slavery, after the Civil War. So it's kind of the same thinking. The idea or the intention is good, right? It's noble. It's supposed to be like this intermediary between the U.S. government and the Native Americans. But by the time we get to, Wounded Knee, it doesn't quite work out that way. Okay. In addition to this, under the Treaty of Fort Laramie and this reservation policy, the national government is going to promise to provide supplies. Food, blankets, you name it. And so the consequence of this is that by providing these supplies to them, right, they're promising to do this to help them. But the consequences, they're taking, normal, peaceful people, totally independent people that are, they can provide for themselves. And essentially what they're doing is they're putting them into a completely different way of life. They are creating a dependent ethnic group here, right? So they're taking an independent group of people and making them totally dependent on government assistance. And again, this is going to have a very, very negative consequence later on down the road. Lastly, to ensure that the natives are going to stay on the reservation, not leave the reservation, pick up farming and other white ways. One of the things that the government sort of comes back to is when trying to identify, okay, what is the problem here? Why is it that they're getting into this conflict? Why is it that, they are having such a problem here? Okay, well, it's because they're chasing around, these buffalo herds. They're hunting the buffalo. And so what the government ends up doing to ensure that the natives are going to stay there is, they slaughter the buffalo. Okay, the government utilizes the buffalo to make the natives change their way of life. And, they basically pay people to kill off the buffalo and nearly to the point of extinction. As we get further along in these chapters, that's one of the consequences of all of this expansion, as well as that, the buffalo, their numbers are going to dwindle all the way to like 12. And it's not until, in recent decades that those numbers have been able to climb back up to, stable number population. So again, this is what the government is trying to do. They are trying to essentially move Native Americans off of the land because, again, the justification is they don't even know how to use the land right. Remember that Native Americans, they don't look at land as something that they can own. It is something that is to be respected. It is something that is to be shared. But Westerners don't look at land that way, right? Land is everything. Land is power. Land is status. The more of it that you have, the more money. And so, they look at natives and they're like, nope, they don't even know how to use it right. So they're getting in the way. We need to move them out of the way of progress, of expansion, of fulfilling our manifest destiny. And this is the primary justification for putting them on those reservations. Okay, so once they're able to do that, okay, natives are going to move to those reservations to their detriment, essentially. But then something interesting happens. And in 1876, Custer, George Armstrong Custer, is going to announce that gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Okay, and so unfortunately, the Black Hills of South Dakota belong to the Sioux. That is where the Sioux and the Cheyenne were moved to because of the reservation policy. And so, these greedy gold seekers were essentially coming onto this reservation, into the Sioux land, and they found gold. And so by the time Custer announces that gold has been discovered there, guess what, the expectation is? It's like, okay, well, what are these Native Americans going to do with the gold? They're not going to do anything with it, right? They don't want it. And so when Custer announces that gold has been discovered there, the expectation is, okay, great. Now we want you to move again. But this time, the Lakota and the Sioux, the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne were ready to fight, right? They're not going to go anywhere. Custer here, he's essentially supposed to suppress the Indians, but he's outnumbered, right? He makes a calculated mistake. He basically thinks that, he's got these like scouts and stuff like that are looking for an opportunity. He thinks, we've got the numbers, we can attack. But unbeknownst to him, around the bend of, Little Bighorn, which is this river, you have thousands more other Native Americans there. So when he decides to attack, these Native Americans essentially they kill him. They outnumber him. They take over and they win. Custer is killed, and After the fall of Custer and his men, the army is going to hunt down all the Native Americans responsible for it. So it is a temporary win for these Native Americans, right? They stood their ground. They're not going anywhere. They put them on these reservations, and now they're basically saying, well, we want you to move again. They're saying, no, it's not going to happen. And so Custer decides to attack, is quickly overrun. He's killed. But now the army is going to hunt them down, and it's going to, make them pay for their attack on Americans as well. And so what we're starting to see here is, a continuation of even worse attitudes towards Native Americans, not just by, U.S. citizens, but by the federal government. These Native Americans were finally pushed into these reservations. They were made dependent on government aid. They were essentially declared wards of the state. Right? They're considered incompetent and unable to manage their own affairs. And so what we're starting to see here, right, these attitudes that are developing here towards Native Americans is, you could look at them as, malevolence, right? That the only good Indian is a dead Indian, or this misdirected humanitarianism, where they believe that, Indians live in these quote unquote inferior societies, and by assimilation into white society, that can be the only way that they can be redeemed. And yet another sort of attitude towards Native Americans can be somewhat realistic, where the main idea is that Native Americans and settlers could coexist, but in separate but equal societies, right? So dividing up the remaining western land, and everybody just kind of separated and away from each other. What we can see from these different attitudes towards Native Americans is that no one really showed any regard for Native American culture. As hostilities between the United States and Native Americans get worse, by 1887, we see, this policy change once again. Okay, and so before we had the reservation policy, right, where the natives are essentially, encouraged to pick up whiteways. But by 1887, the Dawes Act is going to push for assimilation, right? It's going to break up the tribes and push assimilation. So the idea here is to put those Native American children, the next generation, in these boarding schools, with the idea here to quote unquote kill the Indian and save the man. So the attitude is that, these people are living a culture that is not congruent with the American way of life. And so in order to eliminate that enemy, right, to kill the savage, to redeem these people, right, is to essentially to win this war is to take out the next generation. And the way that you do that is by stripping them of their Native American identity, which is what those boarding schools do. These kids are recruited, and they are promised an education. They are promised a future, because essentially what they're saying is that if they continue in what they're doing with their culture and their way of life, they essentially don't have a future in the United States. And so the best option for them is to completely assimilate, learn English, change their names, right? Give them Christian names, cut their hair, change the way that they dress, change their religion. give them a proper Western education so that they can assimilate into American life much easier and, have some kind of a future moving forward. And it's just really sad if you look at the effects of this. Right here, you have an image, or these two images. It's the same kids. This is as they came in, right? And this is after their, makeover or make under, right? It's the same kids. And I always have trouble looking at this and going, okay, who's who? Right? The best that I can do is identify this kid as this one here, right? Because he seems to be the youngest one. But I always have trouble with these other two. But just by looking at it, what do you see here? You see, they have their little moccasins. You see how they have, their long hair. Everything about this image is different than this one, right? Here they have these, Western suits, and they have cut their hair. Even in the way that they're sitting down is different. And so, did these reformers, these people that established these boarding schools, did they do this out of, bad intention? No, they didn't. They genuinely thought that this was the best option, that this was the best thing for these kids. But it's going to have severe consequences because they're essentially stripping them of everything, of their identity, of their name, of their heritage, of their culture, of their tradition, everything. And when these kids go back home, they're not quite received, as welcoming because they're not like the rest anymore. And I think some of us could probably relate to this in one way or another. Living on the border down here in Texas, right, where we basically have to straddle these two identities, these bicultural society, bicultural, like bilingual, bicultural. If you've ever experienced this, I don't know if you have or not, right? But if you lived in Laredo long enough and you're not from here, or you've seen how it's grown over the last couple of years, or even, in my case, decades, it is something, if you consider yourself Mexican American, it is quite interesting when, you go to Mexico and, you're with family or whatever. But that they don't see you as one of them, right? Maybe your Spanish is not as good, or maybe it's non-existent. You might get called out or, be behind your back even, they'll say, oh, you're pocho, pocha, right? It can be hurtful. Because these are supposed to be your blood, right? Your family blood relatives. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what these kids are experiencing because in our attempt to assimilate, to learn the language, to, be American, be proud Americans, maybe you leave some of that cultural identity behind. Take your parents, for example, right? Maybe some of y'all's parents don't speak any English, right? Or have trouble with it, or don't like it when you speak English because they're proud, they've got this proud Mexican heritage. And this may not be the case for everybody. I understand that. But I think part of what women like Sidibo Sa, who wrote about this in her book, what's it called? School Days of an Indian Girl. She begged her parents or begged her mom to let her go to this school, and she wanted to see the land of red apples, and she wanted to ride the iron horse, right? The railroad. She was amazed by, the stories that she heard, and she was so excited to go to this school, and her mom finally relented. Her mom didn't trust these, agents that are trying to recruit her child. But she finally relented, and when Sidibo Sa got there, man, she was just completely mistaken. by what was going to happen. She wrote about how, these teachers, they were cold, she was scared and they didn't offer any kind of comfort. She hated her new clothing, which in her opinion was tight and not modest. She missed her, deerskin moccasins, which were quiet, and they gave her these like clunky, chunky, rubber soled shoes, which you could hear coming from a mile away. But worst of all, she was completely broken by when they cut her hair. And part of the reason for this is because in her culture, somebody with shingled hair or, cut hair, they only did that as either because they were grieving, like they had lost somebody that they loved. So to kind of like symbolize that they were missing a very important part of themselves. And the other reason for, cutting your hair was because you were a coward. So let's say you were in battle and you were captured. They cut your hair to let everybody know that you were a coward or that you should be ashamed. And so when they did this to her, that's what she felt. She felt that she had been cut down. She felt that she should be ashamed. A part of her identity was taken from her. But did these people do it out of malice or, with bad intentions? No, they literally did it because they thought that by cutting off that piece of hair, by giving them these proper haircuts, that they were civilizing them, that they were taking away that savage part of who they were, and giving them something better. And so, like I said, it's going to have these very negative effects. As far as the Native American wars are concerned, what the attitudes reflect is that, the children, defeating the children, the next generation would be the last sort of battle. So by killing the Indian, by stripping them of their identity, by assimilating them, they would no longer be a threat. Okay, so really kind of sad when you look at that. But, by the time we get to 1890, the relationship between the U.S. government and these Native American tribes is really going to deteriorate. It's really getting super bad. Basically, no Native American people anywhere in the West lived freely on their own land by 1890. Even on the reservations, they were being broken up by the Dawes Act. Rations were being cut off. Remember the rations that they were dependent on with the government. They weren't getting them anymore. There's all kinds of outbreaks of measles and whooping cough. Things are so bad. And this guy over here, this is Chief Sidibo. Okay, so Chief Sidibo is still there. And the thing that I want to mention about him is, he's a very well-respected tribal leader, the Dakota Sioux. And he had a vision, okay, that he would die at the hands of his own people, right? So, he's had this vision. He's told him about it. And, by the time we get to 1890, things are really serious. I mean, the tribes are fighting with one another. There's not enough food. The winters are super cold. There's not enough blankets. The Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is essentially like not helping them out anymore. And so there's this kind of movement that has been started by a medicine man named Wovoka. Now, he's essentially, promoting this idea that, there's going to be a day when the white man would essentially no longer harm them, no longer be able to lay their hands on them, and the red man would rule again. Now, his sort of message that he's spreading along these tribes. It's got some elements of Christian and also, Native American elements. What he's essentially saying is that if the Native Americans swore off alcohol, right, and they did this dance, this ghost dance to appeal to their ancestors, that when they did, the whites would essentially leave. It's this idea that, they're going to appease their ancestors and they're doing this dance. Oh, and they're supposed to be wearing these kind of like vests that are supposed to protect them from the bullets of the white man. And so the idea is that they're going to do this dance and they're doing it all together, and that their ancestors would somehow like lift them off of the face of the earth. And when they come back down, that, the earth would lay on top of the white man. So it's almost like, they would be going back to how things used to be. And so, just like listening to this, it's kind of a far-fetched thing to believe in, but that's how desperate things are. That's how bad things are. And so people are willing to believe it. People are willing to go with it. It's a desperate attempt, this belief that praying for restoration of the world that they once knew would happen. And Sitting Bull, he's skeptical, but he allowed for his people, to learn, and to follow this guy Vivoka if they wanted to. So again, like I said, they're supposed to be wearing these sacred shirts and feathers, and supposedly that's what's going to have this power to protect them against the bullets. But that's not what happens, because part of the challenge here is, we're dealing with misinterpretation, misunderstanding. If you saw a bunch of Native Americans, doing this dance and whooping and hollering and chanting, what do you think they would be getting ready to do? How would you interpret that? And so, unfortunately, there's these 5,000 troops that are dispatched, right? They've been watching the Native Americans. They see something's going on. To them, it looks like they're getting ready to attack, right? Doing some kind of ritual, war dance. And so, some of them are going to flee to try to escape these troops, but there's these Native American troops that they heard a rumor that Sitting Bull was going to be joining the ghost dancers. And so, they rushed to bring him in, and, they went to his house and they pulled him out of his house, and someone shot at a Dakota police officer, and then the shooting ensued. And so what ended up happening here is a Lakota police officer shot Sitting Bull in the head. And the last of his visions essentially came true. Now, Chief Bigfoot, he's going to wear this big white flag, and him and his people were transported by the troops to Wounded Knee. What ended up happening at Wounded Knee is you have all of these people that are doing this ghost dance, right? They think this is what's going to appease their ancestors, and it's going to erase the white man off the face of the earth. But instead, what happens is, these troops open fire with rifles and with cannons. The Lakotas here, they did their best to fight back, but they were no match for their weapons. 250 men, women, and children are dead at the end of all of this. And, essentially what happens here is, in the words of the Lakota Sioux, they fell like grass before the sickle. They had no chance. I mean, one of the weapons that they are using here is like a Gatling gun. So if you know what that is, it's like an early machine gun. And we're talking, these are unarmed men, women, and children. And it's a massacre, the massacre at Wounded Knee. This event essentially capitulates the end of any further Native American resistance. There is nothing that Native Americans can do to fight against the federal government at this point. And just like, former slaves in the South, Native Americans will also essentially be left behind in the way of, progress and continued expansion of the United States. Okay. And so it's really kind of symbolic that the fact that they use these, long rifles and like Gatling guns, there's nothing that these guys can do to fight against those kinds of weapons. And it's really symbolic because this is where we're starting to see the ushering in of a new, obviously more industrialized, but also weaponized world. And so this is going to do it all for this unit. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture. Make sure that you make use of that study guide and prepare for the test that is going to be over chapter 16, 17, and 18. If you have any questions, as always, make sure that you reach out, send me an email, and I'll try to be as helpful as I possibly can, okay? I hope you guys have a great day today, and I'll see you on the next one, okay? Bye.